The sky above the flight deck of the aircraft carrier Akagi is a perfect shade of Pacific blue. Vice Admiral Chuchi Nagumo stands on the bridge, his face betraying nothing of the tension coiling in his chest. It is 10:20 in the morning on June 4, 1942, and for the past 2 hours, his staff has been arguing about which weapons to load on the aircraft below. Torpedoes. Then bombs. Then torpedoes again. Now, with enemy dive bombers reported inbound, they are frantically trying to rearm with torpedoes one more time. The deck is a chaos of ordnance, fuel lines, and sweating sailors working at a pace that would have been unthinkable during training exercises. Nagumo watches the organized chaos below and allows himself a moment of confidence. His 4 carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, have never been defeated. They struck Pearl Harbor. They ravaged the Indian Ocean. They are the cutting edge of the Imperial Japanese Navy, the Kido Butai, the first air fleet that has dominated every sea it has sailed. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. What Nagumo does not know, what he cannot know at this moment, is that in approximately 5 minutes, 3 of those 4 carriers will be transformed into floating funeral pyres. He does not know that the arrogance of 6 months of unbroken victory is about to collide with a material reality so devastating that it will break not just ships, but the psychological foundations of Japan's entire naval strategy. He does not know that the words he is about to speak, and the words spoken by the other admirals in his fleet, will be remembered not as the commands of victors, but as the last gasps of men watching their world collapse in real time. This is not a story about a battle. This is a story about what happens when absolute certainty meets absolute catastrophe. This is about what men say when everything they believe, about their training, their equipment, their destiny, is proven catastrophically wrong in the span of a single breath. To understand what Japanese admirals said when 4 carriers sank at Midway, we must first understand what they believed before the bombs fell. We must understand the psychological edifice they had constructed, the narrative of invincibility that had been carefully built through half a year of uninterrupted success. Because the words they spoke in those final moments were not just tactical observations. They were the sound of a worldview shattering. The story begins not on June 4, but on December 7, 1941, when that same strike force, under that same commander, achieved what many considered impossible. 6 carriers launched 183 aircraft in 2 waves against the American Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor. The attack was a masterpiece of coordination and surprise. 8 battleships were damaged or destroyed. Nearly 2,400 Americans were killed. The operation demonstrated Japanese naval aviation's technical superiority and tactical brilliance. Nagumo and his staff had executed the plan flawlessly. When the strike force returned to Japan, they were greeted as heroes. Nagumo himself was cautious in his public statements. He had wanted to launch a 3rd wave against Pearl Harbor's fuel tanks and repair facilities but had been overruled by more conservative voices on his staff. Still, the victory was undeniable. What followed was a rampage across the Pacific that seemed to confirm everything the Japanese naval leadership believed about their superiority. In January of 1942, the Kido Butai supported the invasion of Rabaul. In February, they struck Darwin, Australia, in a raid that destroyed more aircraft than had been lost at Pearl Harbor. In March and April, they entered the Indian Ocean and systematically destroyed British naval power in the region, sinking the carrier Hermes, the cruisers Cornwall and Dorsetshire, and driving the British Eastern Fleet into hiding. By May, the First Air Fleet had not lost a single major vessel. They had sunk 5 battleships, 1 carrier, 2 cruisers, 7 destroyers, and dozens of other ships. They had shot down hundreds of enemy aircraft while losing fewer than 24 of their own pilots. The psychological impact of this success cannot be overstated. The officers and men of the Kido Butai did not just believe they were good. They had empirical evidence, repeated and reinforced, that they were invincible. Their aircraft, the Mitsubishi A6M0 fighter, the Nakajima B5N Kate torpedo bomber, the Aichi D3A Val dive bomber, had outperformed every enemy machine they had encountered. Their pilots, trained in the rigorous pre-war program that emphasized thousands of hours of flight time, were simply better than their opponents. Their tactics, developed through years of study and practice, had proven superior in every engagement. This was not propaganda. This was an observable, verifiable reality. Vice Admiral Nagumo himself embodied this confidence, though in a complex way. He was not a reckless man. He was 55 years old in the spring of 1942, a torpedo and destroyer specialist who had been given command of the carrier force despite having limited aviation experience. Some of his more aggressive subordinates, particularly Rear Admiral Taman Yamaguchi, considered him overly cautious. But caution, in the context of 6 months of unbroken victory, seemed like wisdom. Nagumo had brought his fleet through campaign after campaign without losing a major ship. He had preserved his striking power while achieving every objective assigned to him. If he was conservative in his decision-making, it was because his conservatism had worked. The plan for Midway reflected this confidence, though it also revealed a dangerous complacency. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet, had conceived the operation as a way to force the remnants of the American Pacific Fleet into a decisive battle. The tiny atoll of Midway, sitting at the far northwestern end of the Hawaiian chain, would be invaded. The Americans, Yamamoto believed, would have to respond. They would sortie what carriers they had left. Intelligence suggested they had only 2 or 3 operational after the Battle of the Coral Sea in May, and the combined fleet would destroy them. It would be Pearl Harbor in reverse, a battle that would knock the United States out of the Pacific War for at least a year, perhaps longer. The operation was extraordinarily complex, involving nearly 200 ships divided into multiple task forces spread across thousands of miles of ocean. Yamamoto himself would sail with the main body, 7 battleships including his flagship Yamato, the largest and most powerful battleship ever built. The invasion force would carry 5,000 troops to seize Midway itself. A separate task force would strike the Aleutian Islands as a diversion. And at the center of everything, as always, was Nagumo's first air fleet. For carriers, Akagi and Kaga in the 1st Carrier Division, Soryu and Hiryu in the 2nd Carrier Division. 248 aircraft. The most experienced and successful carrier striking force in naval history. The plan had a weakness, though few in the Japanese Navy seemed concerned about it. The forces were too dispersed. Yamamoto's battleships would sail 300 miles behind Nagumo's carriers, too far to provide support if something went wrong. The invasion force would approach from a different direction entirely. The Aleutian diversion would drain resources without providing any real benefit. Some staff officers worried about this dispersion, but their concerns were dismissed. After all, American carrier doctrine emphasized keeping carriers together for mutual support, and the Americans had lost every major engagement so far. Why change a winning formula? There was another weakness, more subtle and more dangerous. The success of the past 6 months had created a kind of institutional arrogance that manifested in poor intelligence work and overconfidence in planning. Japanese naval intelligence had concluded, with a certainty that would prove catastrophic, that the American carriers were not at Pearl Harbor and could not possibly reach the Midway area before June 8 or 9, 4 or 5 days after the planned invasion. This assessment was based on reasonable analysis of American capabilities and typical deployment patterns. It was also completely wrong. The Americans had broken the Japanese naval codes. They knew the target was Midway. They knew the approximate date of the attack. And they knew where Nagumo's carriers would be. Admiral Chester Nimitz, commanding the Pacific Fleet from Pearl Harbor, had made the decision to ambush the ambushers. He would send everything he had, 3 carriers, only one of which was fully operational, to a position northeast of Midway. They would wait. They would strike first. They would exploit the one advantage they had, which was knowledge of Japanese intentions, to overcome the massive disadvantage they had in experience, training, and proven combat effectiveness. None of this was known to Nagumo as his task force approached Midway in the pre-dawn darkness of June 4. His ships sailed in a compact formation, the 4 carriers in a box pattern with cruisers and destroyers screening them from submarine attack. The sea was calm. The weather was good. Everything was proceeding according to plan. At 4:30 in the morning, the first wave of 108 aircraft began launching to strike Midway Island itself. 36 Nakajima B-5N Kate bombers carrying 800-kilogram bombs. 36 Aichi D-3A Val dive bombers. 36 Mitsubishi Is-6M0 fighters. The strike was led by Lieutenant Joichi Tomonaga, one of the most experienced aviators in the fleet. His orders were simple: destroy American air power on Midway and soften up the defenses for the invasion force. As the strike aircraft departed, Nagumo retained a reserve of 108 aircraft on his 4 carriers, armed with torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs for use against any American ships that might appear. This was standard doctrine. Always keep a reserve ready for the unexpected. It was one of the lessons learned from Pearl Harbor, where Nagumo had faced criticism for not launching a third wave. This time, he would be ready. The attack on Midway itself went reasonably well. Tomonaga's aircraft bombed the airfield, destroyed some buildings, and engaged the defending fighters, a ragtag collection of obsolete Brewster F-2A Buffaloes and Grumman F-4F Wildcats flown by Marine pilots who fought bravely but were outmatched. By 7 o'clock, Tomonaga was radioing back to the fleet. The strike had succeeded, but a second wave would be needed. Midway's airfield was still operational. Planes were still taking off. The defenses had not been completely suppressed. This was when the first crack appeared in the smooth execution of the plan. At 7:15, a message arrived from Tomonaga requesting a second strike. At virtually the same moment, Nagumo's own reconnaissance aircraft were supposed to be reporting on whether any American ships were in the area. But the reconnaissance had been botched. One of the search planes, a Tone-class cruiser's float plane, had been delayed in launching by 30 minutes due to a catapult malfunction. That 30-minute delay, a minor mechanical issue that would have been unremarkable in peacetime, was about to become the most consequential equipment failure in naval history. Nagumo faced a decision. Tomonaga needed a second strike on Midway. The reconnaissance had found nothing, or at least, nothing had been reported yet. The reserve strike force was armed with torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs, ready to attack ships. But if no ships were present, those weapons were useless for attacking Midway's land installations. Standard doctrine was clear: use the right weapon for the right target. At 7:15, Nagumo gave the order. Rearm the reserve strike force. Replace the torpedoes with bombs. Prepare for a second strike on Midway. It was a reasonable decision, based on the information available. It was also a decision that would doom his fleet. The rearming began immediately. On all 4 carriers, hundreds of sailors started the dangerous, time-consuming work of moving torpedoes and bombs around the hangar decks. Torpedoes were unloaded from aircraft and wheeled to the magazines. Bombs were brought up from storage. Aviation fuel was topped off. It was hard, sweaty work in the tropical heat of the closed hangar decks. The men worked quickly, but not recklessly. These were high explosives. A single mistake could destroy a ship. Under normal circumstances, this rearming would take about 90 minutes. Nagumo's men, trained and experienced, could do it in an hour if pressed. The ordnance was stacked neatly, the torpedoes placed near the hangar bulkheads, ready to be taken to the magazines once the immediate rearming was complete. At 7:28, 13 minutes after Nagumo gave the rearming order, everything changed. A radio message from the delayed reconnaissance plane finally arrived. Sight what appears to be 10 enemy surface ships, in position bearing 010 degrees, distance 240 miles from Midway. Course 150 degrees, speed over 20 knots. The message hit Nagumo's staff like a physical blow. Ships. Enemy ships. Where no ships were supposed to be. The planning, the intelligence assessments, the careful calculations, all of it suddenly called into question. But the message was frustratingly vague. What kind of ships? Cruisers? Battleships? Carriers? The type mattered enormously. Cruisers were a nuisance but not a strategic threat. Carriers were everything. At 7:45, Nagumo sent an urgent message back to the scout plane, ascertain ship types and maintain contact. The rearming continued, but now with a sense of urgency mixed with dread. If those ships included carriers, Nagumo's reserve strike force, currently being rearmed with land attack bombs, was configured entirely wrong. He would need torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs after all. But stopping the rearming now, in midstream, would leave the flight decks cluttered and unusable for even longer. At 8 o'clock, still no word on ship types. The first wave from Midway was due back at 8:30. They would need to land, which meant the flight decks had to be clear. At 8:09, another message from the scout plane, enemy is accompanied by what appears to be a carrier. A carrier. The Americans had a carrier. Here. Now. For days before they were supposed to arrive. The entire operational plan had just collapsed. Every assumption about American capabilities and positions was wrong. And Nagumo's reserve strike force was in the middle of being rearmed with the wrong weapons. What happened next was a compressed series of decisions made under enormous pressure, with incomplete information, by men who were slowly realizing that their 6 months of invincibility might have been an illusion sustained only by fighting inferior opponents under ideal conditions. At 8:20, Nagumo made his second crucial decision. He ordered the rearming stopped and reversed. Rearm again with torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs. Prepare to strike the American carrier. The flight decks erupted into barely controlled chaos. Bombs that had just been loaded onto aircraft were unloaded again. Torpedoes that had been wheeled to the magazines were brought back out. Men were running, shouting, trying to work faster than safety protocols allowed. And all of this was happening as the first wave from Midway was approaching, low on fuel, some with battle damage, needing to land immediately. At 8:30, the first American attack arrived. Not from a carrier, Nagumo's staff didn't even know where the American carrier was yet, but from Midway itself. 6 brand-new Grumman TBF Avenger torpedo bombers, flown by Marine pilots who had barely trained in the aircraft, came in low and fast. They were massacred. 0 fighters fell on them like sharks. 5 of the 6 Avengers were shot down. Not a single torpedo hit. But the attack forced the carriers to maneuver, disrupting the landing pattern for the returning strike force. Then came 4 B-26 Marauder medium bombers, also from Midway, also attacking at wave-top height with torpedoes. They were twin-engine land bombers, never designed for naval attack, flown by Army pilots who had no training in ship-to-ship combat. 2 were shot down immediately. The remaining 2 attacked through a wall of anti-aircraft fire and 0 fighters. No hits. Both surviving bombers were so badly damaged they barely made it back to Midway. Then 16 Marine SBD Dauntless dive bombers from Midway, attacking from high altitude. Then 15 B-17 Flying Fortress heavy bombers, dropping bombs from 20,000 feet. The attacks were uncoordinated, piecemeal, and almost completely ineffective. Not one bomb hit. Not one torpedo struck home. The American aircraft were being shot down or driven off in droves. For Nagumo and his staff, watching from Akagi's bridge, it might have seemed like confirmation that despite the unexpected presence of an American carrier, Japanese superiority would prevail. The Americans were brave, perhaps even recklessly so. But they were incompetent. Their attacks were suicidal. Their torpedoes were slow and easy to evade. Their tactics were primitive. But these attacks had an effect that was not visible from Akagi's bridge. They consumed time. Every time the carriers had to turn to evade torpedoes, every time the fighters had to climb to intercept bombers, every time the anti-aircraft crews had to track new targets, minutes ticked away. Minutes during which the American carrier strike force from Enterprise in Yorktown was closing the distance. Minutes during which Nagumo's flight decks remained cluttered with aircraft, ordnance, and fuel lines. Minutes during which the reserve strike force, so carefully preserved and rearmed and re-rearmed, could not launch. By 9:18, the attacks from Midway had finally ended. The immediate threat seemed to be over. Now Nagumo could focus on the real problem, the American carrier. At 9:18, he gave the order to recover the first wave from Midway. 108 aircraft began landing on the 4 carriers, circling in pattern, touching down, folding their wings, being wheeled forward to make room for the next plane. This process would take at least 30 to 40 minutes. During that time, the carriers could not launch any strikes. The flight decks were occupied. The reserve strike force would have to wait. On Akagi's bridge, Nagumo conferred with his staff. Where was the American carrier? The last reported position had been nearly 250 miles away, far beyond strike range. Even if the Americans had immediately launched their aircraft, and there was no indication they had, those planes wouldn't arrive for hours. There was time. There was always time. The morning's confusion had been unsettling, certainly, but it was being resolved. Once the Midway strike force was recovered, once the reserve force was properly armed and spotted on the flight decks, Nagumo would launch everything at the American carrier. The first air fleet would show the Americans what a real coordinated strike looked like. What Nagumo did not know, what his reconnaissance had failed to detect, what his intelligence had failed to predict, was that the Americans had launched everything they had nearly 2 hours earlier. 3 separate strike groups from 3 different carriers were already in the air, searching for the Japanese fleet. And through a combination of luck, determination, and the navigational intuition of a few key squadron commanders, some of those strike groups were about to find their target. At 9:30, the first American torpedo bombers appeared. 15 Douglas TBD Devastator torpedo bombers from the carrier Hornet, led by Lieutenant Commander John Waldron, came in low over the water. They were obsolete aircraft, slow and poorly armored, carrying torpedoes that were notoriously unreliable. Waldron had been flying for hours, searching for the Japanese fleet, and had made the decision to break from his assigned search pattern and follow his instinct about where the carriers would be. His instinct was correct. He found them. And it cost him everything. The Zeros fell on Waldron's squadron like a hammer. The Japanese fighters, which had been pulled down to low altitude by the earlier attacks from Midway, were perfectly positioned. They tore through the formation. The Devastators had no fighter escort, the Wildcats that were supposed to protect them had gotten separated during the long search. One by one, the torpedo bombers were shot down. Waldron himself was killed in the first minutes. His wingmen followed him into the sea. Within 10 minutes, all 15 Devastators were gone. Only one pilot, Ensign George Gay, survived, floating in the water amid the debris of his squadron, watching what happened next. At 9:58, 14 more Devastators appeared. These were from Enterprise, led by Lieutenant Commander Eugene Lindsay. They attacked from a different angle, trying to split the Japanese combat air patrol. The result was the same. Zeros swarmed them. Anti-aircraft fire from the screening cruisers and destroyers filled the sky with black bursts. 10 of the 14 Devastators were shot down. Not a single torpedo found its target. The slow, straight-running American Mark 13 torpedoes were easy to evade. The carriers simply turned, presenting their narrow sterns to the incoming weapons, and the torpedoes slid past harmlessly. At 10:02, 12 more Devastators from Yorktown, led by Lieutenant Commander Lance Massey, pressed home their attack. Same result. 7 shot down. No hits. Massey himself was killed. The ocean around the Japanese fleet was littered with burning aircraft and drowning American aircrews. Of 41 torpedo bombers that attacked that morning, 35 were destroyed. The American torpedo squadrons had been effectively annihilated. Their attacks had been brave to the point of suicide, but tactically they had accomplished nothing. Or so it seemed. What the torpedo squadrons had accomplished, without knowing it, without intending it, was to pull every single Japanese fighter down to sea level. The Zeros, following their training and their instincts, had chased the torpedo bombers down to the wave tops. They were now at low altitude, low on ammunition, some low on fuel. The combat air patrol had been perfectly positioned to slaughter torpedo bombers. It was now perfectly positioned to miss what was coming from above. At 10:20, Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, leading 33 SBD Dauntless dive bombers from Enterprise, was about to give up his search. He had been flying for over 2 hours. His fuel was running low. He had seen nothing. Then, far below, he spotted a lone Japanese destroyer steaming at high speed. The destroyer was Arisher, racing to catch up with the carrier force after being delayed by a submarine contact. McCluskey made a decision. The destroyer was heading somewhere. Follow it. He followed it straight to the Japanese carriers. From 15,000 feet, McCluskey could see all 4 carriers. They were in the middle of their most vulnerable moment. The flight decks were packed with aircraft being prepared for launch. The reserve strike force, armed and fueled, was being spotted on the decks. Hoses snaked across the wood planking, pumping aviation gasoline. Ordnance carts were still moving bombs and torpedoes. The hangars below were crowded with aircraft from the Midway strike, being serviced and rearmed. There were no fighters at altitude to intercept. The carriers had spent the last 40 minutes dodging torpedo attacks, their attention focused entirely on the sea-level threat. No one was looking up. On Akagi's bridge, Nagumo was watching the last of the Midway strike force land. The recovery was almost complete. A few more minutes and the decks would be clear. Then the reserve force could launch. The American torpedo attacks had been beaten off. The Americans had lost dozens of aircraft and accomplished nothing. Victory was still certain. Delayed, perhaps, but certain. At 10:22, a lookout on Akagi screamed a warning. Dive bombers. High altitude. Incoming. What happened next occurred so quickly that survivors later had difficulty determining the exact sequence. Multiple witnesses reported slightly different timings, different numbers of bombs, different angles of attack. But the core facts are not in dispute. 3 Japanese carriers were hit in rapid succession, in a span of time that most accounts agree was between 4 and 6 minutes. Some say 5. The precise duration matters less than the fact that it was instantaneous in any meaningful military sense. There was no time to react, no time to maneuver, no time to implement damage control procedures. The superiority that had been built over 6 months, that had seemed unshakable just minutes before, evaporated in the time it takes to boil water. McCluskey's dive bombers split into 2 groups. One group, led by Lieutenant Richard Best, dove on Akagi. The other group, led by Lieutenant Earl Gallagher, dove on Kaga. The attack was not perfectly coordinated. This was not the kind of massed, simultaneous strike that Japanese doctrine emphasized. But it didn't need to be. The carriers were helpless. The dive bombers came down in 70-degree angles, reaching speeds of over 250 miles per hour. The Dauntless was not a graceful aircraft, but in a dive it was stable and accurate. The pilots could see their targets with perfect clarity. They released at around 1,500 feet and pulled out, the G-forces crushing them into their seats. Best's section put at least 2 bombs into Akagi. The first hit aft of the midship elevator, penetrating to the hangar deck. The second hit near the aft elevator itself. Neither bomb was particularly large. The SBD carried either a 1,000-pound bomb or a 500-pound bomb, but size didn't matter. What mattered was where they hit and what they hit. Akagi's flight deck was covered with fully fueled, fully armed aircraft. The hangar deck was packed with more aircraft, more fuel, more ordnance. The torpedoes that had been removed during the morning's rearming confusion were still sitting near the bulkheads, not yet returned to the magazines. The bombs exploded among this volatile mass of fuel and explosives. The initial blast was followed immediately by secondary explosions. Fuel tanks ruptured. Aviation gasoline, which vaporizes rapidly in tropical heat, creates an explosive atmosphere. Bombs and torpedoes, jarred by the shock, began to detonate. Within seconds, fires were raging out of control on both the flight deck and hangar deck. The conflagration was so intense that it created its own weather, sucking in air and blowing out smoke in a massive column visible for miles. Captain Taijiro Aoki, Akagi's commanding officer, immediately tried to organize damage control. But the ship's fire mains had been damaged by the bomb hits. Water pressure was failing. The hangar deck was an inferno, the temperatures so high that paint was blistering off the bulkheads. Men trying to fight the fires were driven back by walls of flame. Others were killed instantly when stored ordnance exploded. The ship's communication systems were failing. Orders had to be shouted or carried by runners. And the fires were spreading faster than they could be contained. On the bridge, Nagumo stood frozen. Witnesses later recalled that his face showed no expression. He said nothing. He simply stared at the flames consuming his flagship. His staff officers were shouting, trying to understand what had happened, trying to organize a response. Commander Tomatsu Oishi, the senior staff officer, grabbed Nagumo by the arm. "Admiral, we must transfer your flag to another ship. Akagi is lost." Nagumo did not respond immediately. When he finally spoke, his words were not tactical observations or commands. They were a simple, devastating acknowledgement of reality. How could this happen? How could this happen? He repeated the question several times, according to survivors. Not as if he expected an answer, but as if he could not comprehend what he was seeing. The invincible fleet was burning. Simultaneously, less than a mile away, Kaga was dying. Gallagher's dive bombers had hit her with at least 4 bombs, possibly 5. The aft part of the flight deck was shattered. The forward part was an inferno. Fire spread through the hangar deck with terrifying speed. Kaga carried more aircraft than any other carrier in the fleet, over 90, and many of them were now contributing to an expanding fireball. Captain Jisaku Okada tried to save his ship. He organized firefighting parties. He tried to flood the magazines before the fire could reach them. But the damage was too extensive, too rapidly spreading. Within minutes, Kaga's engineering spaces were being evacuated. The fires were so hot that the metal decks were glowing red. Men attempting to descend to fight fires below were turned back by heat that made breathing impossible. And then there was Soryu. At almost the same moment that Akagi and Kaga were hit, 17 SBD dive bombers from Yorktown, led by Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie, found Soryu slightly separated from the other carriers. Leslie's attack was textbook perfect. His bombers dove from 14,000 feet in a coordinated assault. 3 bombs hit, possibly 4. One struck the forward part of the flight deck. Another hit amidships. A third struck aft. Soryu's commanding officer, Captain Ryosaku Yanagimoto, had just been informed that his aircraft were ready to launch. He was on the bridge, preparing to give the order to begin the strike, when the first bomb exploded. The blast killed most of the men on the bridge instantly. Yanagimoto himself was thrown against a bulkhead but survived, badly injured. Soryu caught fire even faster than her sisters. She was a smaller carrier, more lightly built, and the bombs penetrated deeper into her structure. The fires reached the aviation fuel storage tanks within minutes. Massive explosions began tearing through her hull. Her engineering plant was damaged. She began losing power. Her speed dropped. Dead in the water, burning from stem to stern, Soryu was transforming from a warship into a floating volcano. 3 carriers. Akagi, Kaga, Soryu. All 3 hit within a span that survivors from various ships estimated as between 4 and 6 minutes. The pride of the Imperial Japanese Navy, the carriers that had never been defeated, were now drifting, burning, exploding hulks. Of the 248 aircraft the First Air Fleet had brought to Midway, more than half were now on fire or had been destroyed. The pilots and aircrew who had survived the morning's operations were trapped on burning ships, or had died in the initial explosions, or were abandoning ship into oil-slicked water. Rear Admiral Taman Yamaguchi, commanding the 2nd Carrier Division from the carrier Hiryu, watched the disaster unfold from his flagship's bridge. Hiryu had been positioned further north than the other 3 carriers, a spacing decision that now became her salvation. The American dive bombers had not attacked her. She was undamaged. She still had her full air group. Yamaguchi was known throughout the fleet as an aggressive, forward-thinking officer. He had been educated at Princeton, spoke fluent English, and was considered one of the rising stars of the Imperial Navy. He understood carrier warfare in a way that many of his contemporaries did not. and he understood immediately that he was now the only Japanese officer with any striking power left. Yamaguchi's first words, according to multiple witnesses, were directed at his staff. "Prepare to launch immediately. All available aircraft." His voice was calm, controlled. If he felt shock at seeing 3 carriers destroyed in minutes, he did not show it. One of his staff officers, Commander Susumu Kawaguchi, later recalled that Yamaguchi's demeanor was like ice. He did not panic. He was not frozen with disbelief like Nagumo. He was already thinking about the counterattack. But even Yamaguchi's composure could not conceal the desperation of the situation. Hiryu had 40 operational aircraft remaining. The American strike force had come from at least 1 carrier, possibly more. The Americans still had their full striking power. The Japanese had lost 3/4 of theirs. The mathematics was brutal. And there was another factor, one that Yamaguchi understood but could not articulate in front of his men. The psychological advantage, the aura of invincibility that had sustained the First Air Fleet through 6 months of victories, was gone. They had been caught unprepared. They had been outmaneuvered. The Americans, whom they had dismissed as brave but incompetent, had just executed a near-perfect strike. At 10:40, Yamaguchi ordered his attack force to launch. 18 Aichi D-3A Val dive bombers and 6 Mitsubishi Is-6M0 fighters took off from Hiryu's deck. They were led by Lieutenant Michio Kobayashi, one of the most experienced dive bomber leaders in the fleet. Their target was the American carrier that had launched the devastating strike. If Hiryu could sink that carrier, if she could even the odds, then perhaps the battle could still be salvaged. Back on Akagi, the situation was deteriorating rapidly. By 11 o'clock, the fires were completely out of control. The hangar deck was a furnace. Explosions continued as stored ordnance cooked off in the heat. The fire was spreading toward the forward magazines, where tons of bombs and torpedoes were stored. If those magazines exploded, Akagi would be blown apart. Captain Aoki knew this. He gave the order to flood the forward magazines. But the ship's pumping systems were damaged. The magazines could not be flooded. The only option was evacuation. At 11:30, Rear Admiral Ryanosuke Kusaka, Nagumo's chief of staff, made the decision that Nagumo himself seemed incapable of making. "Admiral," he said, "we must transfer your flag. Akagi is lost. You must command the fleet from another ship." Nagumo, who had been standing on the bridge staring at the flames for over an hour, finally nodded. He would transfer to the light cruiser Nagara. But first, the Emperor's portrait, kept in a special shrine on every Japanese warship, had to be transferred. This was not negotiable. The portrait could not be allowed to burn. A group of sailors fought their way through smoke and flames to retrieve the portrait. They brought it to the bridge, carefully wrapped. Only then did Nagumo agree to leave. He climbed down from the bridge, his face expressionless, his uniform scorched and stained with soot. Crew members later recalled that he seemed to be in a state of shock, moving mechanically, responding to questions with single-word answers or not at all. He boarded a launch that took him to the destroyer Nawaki, which then transferred him to Nagara. The entire time, according to witnesses, he clutched the wrapped portrait and said almost nothing. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Once aboard Nagara, Nagumo established a makeshift command center. But the fleet he now commanded was a shadow of what it had been 2 hours earlier. Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu were burning, drifting hulks. Their crews were abandoning ships or fighting hopeless battles against fires that could not be controlled. Hundreds of men were already dead. Hundreds more were wounded, burned, trapped below decks. The screening cruisers and destroyers were picking up survivors from the water, men who had jumped from flight decks now hot enough to melt rubber. And in the midst of all this, Nagumo had to make decisions about what to do next. The reports coming in were fragmentary and confusing. Hiryu had launched a strike, but there was no word yet on its results. The Americans had at least 1 carrier, possibly more. the location of the American fleet was uncertain. Yamamoto's main body, with its powerful battleships, was still 300 miles away. The invasion force was approaching Midway, unaware that the carrier support they were counting on had been destroyed. And in Tokyo, the naval general staff had no idea what had happened. They still believed the operation was proceeding according to plan. On Nagara's cramped bridge, Nagumo conferred with Kusaka and the other surviving staff officers. What were their options? They could withdraw, pull back the invasion force, and try to preserve what was left of the fleet. But withdrawal would be an admission of defeat, something the Imperial Navy had not experienced in living memory. They could press forward, hoping that Hiryu's strike would cripple the American carriers and that Yamamoto's battleships could close the distance and bring their guns to bear. But that was gambling everything on a single carrier that was outnumbered and outgunned. Kusaka, a cautious man by nature, argued for withdrawal. "Admiral," he said, "according to post-war testimony, we have lost 3 carriers. We cannot continue this operation. We must preserve Hiryu and withdraw to fight another day." Nagumo listened, but said little. His silence was becoming unnerving to his staff. This was not the cautious but decisive commander they knew. This was a man who had been psychologically broken by the speed and totality of the disaster. Commander Jishiro Miura, the fleet operations officer, took a different view. "If we withdraw now," he argued, "we hand the Americans a complete victory. We must continue the attack. Yamamoto is coming. Hiryu is attacking. We can still win this." It was the voice of desperation, of a man unwilling to accept that the battle was already lost. But it reflected a genuine belief, shared by many officers, that the Japanese fighting spirit could overcome material disadvantage. While this debate continued on Nagara, Hiryu's strike force found its target. At 12:03, Kobayashi's dive bombers attacked the carrier Yorktown. The Japanese attack was skillfully executed. Despite heavy anti-aircraft fire and defending fighters, 3 bombs hit Yorktown. The carrier was badly damaged, her fire started, her flight operations halted. For a brief moment, it seemed like Yamaguchi's aggressive response might salvage something from the disaster. The Americans had lost a carrier. The odds were slightly less terrible. But Yorktown did not sink. Her damage control parties, trained to a standard that the Japanese could not match, fought the fires and stabilized the ship. Within 2 hours, she was making headway again, her fires mostly under control. And more critically, the Americans still had 2 undamaged carriers, Enterprise and Hornet. The Japanese had 1, Hiryu. The strategic situation had not changed. Japan was still losing. Yamaguchi, receiving reports of the attack's success, immediately prepared a second strike. He would throw everything remaining at the Americans. 10 more torpedo bombers, 6 more fighters. They launched at 1:30 in the afternoon. This strike, led by Lieutenant Joichi Tomonaga, the same officer who had led the morning strike on Midway, found Yorktown again. In a superbly executed torpedo attack, 2 Type 91 torpedoes hit the American carrier. This time, the damage was catastrophic. Yorktown's engineering spaces flooded. She lost power. Her list increased. At 3 o'clock, her captain gave the order to abandon ship. But even this success could not alter the fundamental reality. Hiryu was now defenseless. She had launched all her aircraft. Her flight deck was empty. She had no fighters to intercept an American counterstrike. And that counterstrike was already in the air. At 5 o'clock, 24 SBD Dauntless dive bombers from Enterprise found Hiryu. Yamaguchi watched them come. He was on the flight deck, having come up from the bridge to personally observe the defense of his ship. Witnesses recalled that he stood calmly, almost serenely, as the dive bombers began their attack. The ship's anti-aircraft guns opened fire, throwing up a barrage of shells. 0 fighters that had been returning from the second strike tried to intercept. But there were too few of them, and they were low on fuel and ammunition. 4 bombs hit Hiryu. 1 struck forward, wrecking the flight deck and starting fires that immediately spread to the hangar below. 2 hit amidships, penetrating deep into the ship's vitals. A 4th hit aft. Within minutes, Hiryu was in the same condition as her sisters. Fires raged through her hangar deck. Explosions shook her hull as stored ordnance detonated. Her engineering spaces were threatened. Her communications were disrupted. She was dying. Captain Tomio Kaku, Hiryu's commanding officer, organized damage control efforts. But like the captains of Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu before him, he quickly realized that the situation was hopeless. The fires were too extensive. The damage was too severe. At 8 o'clock in the evening, he reported to Yamaguchi that the ship could not be saved. They should prepare to abandon ship. Yamaguchi's response was calm and immediate. "I will remain aboard," he said. "I will go down with the ship. That is my duty as commander of the 2nd Carrier Division." Kaku protested. There was no need for the admiral to die. The battle was over. Yamaguchi could transfer his flag, and could live to fight another day. But Yamaguchi was adamant. His division, Soryu and Hiryu, had been destroyed. He bore responsibility. He would not survive them. Kaku, hearing this, made his own decision. "Then I too will remain aboard. As captain of Hiryu, I share that responsibility." The 2 men, admiral and captain, sat together on the bridge as the fires closed in around them. Witnesses who left the ship in the final evacuation saw them there, Yamaguchi still wearing his uniform cap, Kaku beside him, both sitting quietly as if waiting for something inevitable. Before the final evacuation, Yamaguchi composed a message to be sent to Admiral Yamamoto. The message was brief, stripped of any emotion or self-pity. "I alone am to blame for the loss of Hiryu and Soryu. I will remain aboard and share their fate. I apologize for not having served better." It was handwritten, given to a staff officer to carry ashore, and later delivered to the commander of the combined fleet. Yamamoto, reading it hours later aboard his flagship Yamato, reportedly wept. At around 2 o'clock in the morning on June 5, Hiryu's final moments approached. The fires had consumed most of the ship. The hull was glowing red in places from the heat. There were still men aboard, trapped below decks or too badly wounded to evacuate. Their screams could be heard across the water by the destroyer crews standing by. The decision was made to scuttle the ship with torpedoes, to end her agony and prevent her capture. Destroyers fired multiple torpedoes into her hull. The explosions tore her open. She sank bow first, the flames still visible as she went under, taking Yamaguchi and Kaku with her. Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu suffered similar fates, though their deaths were more prolonged. Akagi burned throughout the night of June 4 and into the morning of June 5. Captain Aoki had refused to abandon her until the last possible moment. Firefighting teams went back aboard multiple times, trying desperately to save her. But the fires would not be controlled. The forward magazines finally exploded around 4:30 in the morning, nearly breaking the ship in half. At 4:50, Admiral Yamamoto, now in overall tactical command after Nagumo's de facto collapse, sent the order, "Scuttle Akagi." Destroyers fired torpedoes into her. She sank slowly, stern first, at 5 o'clock in the morning on June 5, 1942. Kaga sank first of the 4. Her fires had been the most intense, her damage the most severe. She exploded and sank at 7:20 on the evening of June 4, just 9 hours after being hit. Over 800 of her crew died with her. Soryu held out until 7:13 on the evening of June 4. Like Hiryu, her captain, Ryosaku Yanagimoto, chose to go down with his ship. He was last seen tied to the bridge railing, watching the fires, refusing all entreaties to abandon ship. 718 men died with Soryu. In the span of less than 24 hours, the First Air Fleet had ceased to exist. For fleet carriers, the core of Japanese naval striking power, were on the bottom of the Pacific. Over 3,000 sailors and airmen were dead. More than 250 aircraft were destroyed. And the psychological damage was perhaps even greater than the material loss. The myth of invincibility was shattered. The belief that Japanese training, spirit, and technology were superior had been proven false. The Americans, dismissed as soft and incompetent, had outfought them. Admiral Yamamoto received the first fragmentary reports of the disaster while still aboard his flagship Yamato, steaming toward Midway with the main body of the combined fleet. The initial messages were confusing, contradictory. Akagi was hit by bombs. Fires out of control. Kaga was heavily damaged. Soryu burning. Each message seemed worse than the last. Yamamoto's staff officers gathered around him, trying to make sense of the incoming reports. How could this have happened? The Americans were supposed to have 2 carriers at most. They were supposed to be days away. The intelligence, the planning, the careful calculations, all of it was wrong. Yamamoto's first instinct was to press forward. He ordered the main body to increase speed, racing to close the distance with the American fleet. If he could bring his battleships into gun range, if he could force a night surface action, perhaps the battle could still be salvaged. The Americans feared night fighting. Japanese destroyer and cruiser crews were trained to a high standard in night combat. The Americans had carriers, yes, but carriers were vulnerable at night. They could not launch or recover aircraft in darkness. A night battle would neutralize their advantage. But as more reports arrived, as the full scope of the disaster became clear, Yamamoto realized that pressing forward was futile. He could not close the distance fast enough. The Americans, having achieved their objective, would withdraw. They would not risk their remaining carriers in a night surface action against battleships. And even if Yamamoto could somehow force a confrontation, what would it accomplish? The invasion force could not land on Midway without carrier air support. The transports would be slaughtered by American land-based aircraft. The entire operational concept depended on Japanese carrier superiority. That superiority no longer existed. At 2:30 in the morning on June 5, Yamamoto issued the order to withdraw. The Midway operation was cancelled. All forces would retire westward. The transports would turn back. The surviving elements of the First Air Fleet would be escorted to safety. It was the first time in the war that a major Japanese naval operation had been called off due to enemy action. The psychological impact of that order, among the officers who received it, cannot be overstated. The Imperial Navy did not retreat. The Imperial Navy did not cancel operations. The Imperial Navy achieved its objectives. Until now. Yamamoto took the defeat personally. Multiple witnesses aboard Yamato reported that he remained in his cabin for most of June 5, speaking to no one, eating nothing. When he finally emerged, his face showed an exhaustion that went beyond physical tiredness. His staff officers, who had served with him for years, said they had never seen him look so aged. At one point, according to Commander Yasuji Watanabe, Yamamoto spoke quietly to his inner circle. "I fear we have awakened a sleeping giant," he said. It was a paraphrase of words he had supposedly spoken after Pearl Harbor, but now, after Midway, they carried a different weight. Not prophecy, but recognition of a reality that had already arrived. Nagumo, transferred from Nagara to the cruiser Atago after Nagara developed mechanical problems, remained in a state of near catatonic shock for days. He wrote nothing in his official log about the battle until June 7, 3 days after the disaster. When he finally composed his after-action report, it was a flat, emotionless recitation of events, stripped of analysis or reflection. He noted the timing of the attacks, the damage to each ship, the casualties. But he offered no explanation for how it had happened, no assessment of what had gone wrong. It was as if he could not bring himself to examine the failure too closely. In private conversations, according to officers who served with him, Nagumo spoke repeatedly about the reconnaissance failure. The delayed catapult launch on the Tone's float plane. That 30-minute delay. If that plane had launched on time, if it had spotted the American carriers earlier, everything might have been different. The reserve strike force could have been launched before the American dive bombers arrived. The First Air Fleet might have destroyed the American carriers instead of being destroyed by them. That 30-minute delay had cost Japan the battle, perhaps the war. It was a convenient narrative. It focused blame on a mechanical failure, or random malfunction that no one could have predicted or prevented. It avoided more uncomfortable questions. Why had the reconnaissance been so poorly planned in the first place? Why had only one search plane been assigned to the critical sector where the American carriers actually were? Why had the intelligence been so catastrophically wrong about American carrier positions? Why had the operational plan dispersed Japanese forces so widely that they could not support each other? Why had the rearming procedures been so chaotic and time-consuming? Why had there been no contingency plan for what to do if American carriers appeared earlier than expected? These questions were asked quietly among junior officers in the weeks after Midway, but they were not asked at the highest levels of command. To ask them would be to admit that the defeat was not the result of bad luck or a random mechanical failure, but of fundamental flaws in Japanese naval doctrine, planning, and training. It would be to admit that the invincibility of the First Air Fleet had been an illusion all along, sustained only by fighting inferior opponents under ideal circumstances. It would be to admit that the Americans, whom they had dismissed, were actually better organized, better trained, and better prepared for the kind of warfare that carriers enabled. The Japanese Navy, as an institution, was not prepared to make those admissions. Instead, the official narrative that emerged placed the blame on chance, on the reconnaissance failure, on the bravery of the American torpedo squadrons that had disrupted Japanese operations. The American dive bombers had gotten lucky. They had arrived at exactly the right moment, when the Japanese carriers were most vulnerable. The attack had been uncoordinated, almost accidental in its success. Any competent military analysis would recognize it as a fluke, an unlikely convergence of favorable circumstances that the Americans could never replicate. This narrative was comforting, but it was false. The Americans had not gotten lucky. They had executed a strategic ambush based on superior intelligence, breaking the Japanese codes and using that information to position their carriers exactly where they needed to be. The dive bomber attacks had not been accidental. They had been launched hours earlier, searching for the Japanese fleet, led by commanders like Wade McCluskey who made good tactical decisions under pressure. The apparent lack of coordination was actually a result of independent squadron commanders all converging on the same target using different routes, which had the unintended effect of overwhelming the Japanese defenses. The torpedo squadrons had not been trying to create a diversion. They had been trying to sink carriers, and they had failed, but their attacks had pulled the Japanese combat air patrol out of position. The Americans had learned from their early defeats and had adapted their tactics. The Japanese had not. But acknowledging this would require acknowledging that Japan might lose the war. And in June of 1942, with the Emperor's portrait still sacred and the Bushido Code still paramount, that acknowledgement was impossible. The full truth of what happened at Midway was suppressed in Japan for years. The survivors of the 4 carriers were quarantined when they returned to Japan, forbidden from discussing the battle with anyone outside their units. The casualty lists were classified. The families of dead sailors were told their sons had died heroically in an operation that had achieved its objectives. The newspapers reported a great victory at Midway, claiming that American carriers had been sunk and the invasion had succeeded. Even within the Navy itself, many officers were not told the full extent of the losses. The carriers were officially listed as undergoing repairs rather than sunk. It was months before some junior officers learned the truth. This culture of denial extended to the highest levels. When the Naval General Staff conducted its post-battle analysis, the report focused almost entirely on tactical minutiae, the timing of the attacks, the type of bombs used, the performance of individual aircraft, while avoiding strategic questions about why the battle had been fought at all or whether the operational plan had been sound. The implicit assumption was that the plan had been correct, and only the execution had failed. If the reconnaissance had worked properly, if the rearming had been faster, if the combat air patrol had been at the right altitude, Japan would have won. Therefore, the solution was to fix these tactical problems, not to rethink fundamental concepts. This failure to learn from Midway would haunt the Japanese Navy for the rest of the war. The institutional culture that had produced the disaster, the overconfidence, the rigid adherence to doctrine, the poor intelligence work, the inability to adapt under pressure, was never seriously examined or reformed. Instead, the Navy doubled down on the same approaches that had failed. More carriers would be built. More pilots would be trained. The Japanese fighting spirit would overcome material disadvantages. The next battle would be different. But the next battle was not different. At the Battle of the Philippines Sea in June of 1944, Japanese naval aviation was massacred by American fighters in what became known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. At the Battle of Leyte Gulf in October of 1944, the Japanese Navy committed virtually every remaining ship to a desperate gamble and was effectively destroyed as a fighting force. By 1945, the carriers that had been built to replace Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu were being used as decoys, sent into battle with no aircraft aboard, serving only to draw American attention away from other targets. The First Air Fleet, reconstituted multiple times, never regained its effectiveness. The psychological blow dealt at Midway was never overcome. For the individual admirals who survived Midway, the burden of the defeat was carried differently by each man. Nagumo was reassigned to shore duty in Japan for several months, essentially removed from frontline command while the Navy decided what to do with him. He was too senior, too well-connected, too integral to the pre-war planning to simply dismiss. In March of 1943, he was given command of the Central Pacific Area Fleet, based in the Marianas. It was a backwater assignment, a holding position for an admiral who had lost the confidence of his superiors but could not be openly disgraced. When the Americans invaded Saipan in June of 1944, Nagumo was in command of ground defenses. As the island fell and American forces closed in on his headquarters, Nagumo committed suicide on July 6, 1944. He was 57 years old. His final words, according to witnesses, were a formal apology to the emperor for failing in his duty. He made no mention of Midway. Yamaguchi's death at Midway itself, choosing to go down with Hiryu, was seen by many in the Navy as the proper response to such a defeat. His decision to remain aboard his burning carrier, to share the fate of his men, fit the samurai ideal that still held enormous influence in military culture. He became, in the official narrative, a tragic hero, a capable commander who had fought brilliantly with the forces available to him and had accepted responsibility for his division's destruction in the only honorable way possible. There were no uncomfortable questions about whether his aggressive counterattacks had been wise, whether Hiryu should have withdrawn instead of launching attacks that achieved nothing except her own destruction. Yamaguchi had demonstrated fighting spirit until the end. That was what mattered. Yamamoto remained commander-in-chief of the combined fleet until April of 1943, when his aircraft was intercepted and shot down by American fighters during an inspection tour of the Solomon Islands. The Americans had broken the Japanese codes and knew his exact itinerary. Yamamoto died at age 59, shot down by the same intelligence advantage that had doomed his fleet at Midway. The irony was noted by some Japanese officers after the war, though never officially acknowledged. The man who had warned that Japan could not win a protracted war with America had been proven right, and had died still trying to achieve the decisive battle that would change the strategic calculus. The broader strategic consequences of Midway took months to fully manifest, but they were profound. Japan lost the initiative in the Pacific. The careful balance of carrier power that had favored Japan for the first 6 months of the war shifted permanently to the Americans. By the end of 1942, the Americans had more fleet carriers in the Pacific than Japan. By the end of 1943, the disparity was overwhelming. The industrial capacity that Yamamoto had feared, the sleeping giant that he had worried about awakening, was now fully mobilized. American shipyards were producing Essex-class carriers, larger, more capable, more survivable than anything Japan could build, at a rate of nearly one per month. American pilot training programs were graduating thousands of aviators with hundreds of hours of flight time. American doctrine was evolving rapidly, incorporating lessons learned and adapting tactics. Japan, meanwhile, could not replace what had been lost at Midway. The carriers could be built, eventually, though it took years. But the pilots could not be replaced. The experienced aircrew who had died on those 4 carriers, the veterans who had trained for years before the war, who had fought at Pearl Harbor and Darwin and the Indian Ocean, were irreplaceable. Japan's pilot training program, already inadequate for wartime attrition, could not produce aviators of comparable skill in the timeframe needed. The replacement pilots who did complete training had a fraction of the flight hours that their predecessors had accumulated. They were sent into combat against increasingly skilled American pilots flying increasingly superior aircraft. The results were predictable. Japanese naval aviation never recovered from the losses at Midway, not in quality and eventually not in quantity either. The psychological impact within Japan itself was carefully managed but ultimately corrosive. The suppression of the truth about Midway, the official lies about a great victory, created a gap between reality and propaganda that gradually widened as the war continued. Soldiers and sailors who had seen the defeats with their own eyes knew the official accounts were false. Families who had lost sons at Midway knew that the victory announcements were lies. This erosion of trust in official pronouncements would contribute, in small ways, to the breakdown of civilian morale in the final years of the war. When the government claimed that Japan was winning, that victory was certain, that the fighting spirit of the Japanese people would overcome material disadvantage, there were those who remembered Midway and knew these claims were hollow. For the United States, Midway was the first clear, unambiguous victory of the Pacific War. It proved that the Japanese could be beaten, that their carriers were not invincible, that their pilots were not superhuman. The victory came at a cost. Yorktown was lost, along with 145 aircraft and 307 men, but the exchange ratio was dramatically in America's favor. More importantly, it shifted the psychological dynamic of the war. American forces, which had been retreating and losing for 6 months, now had evidence that they could win. The string of defeats, Pearl Harbor, Wake Island, the Philippines, the Dutch East Indies, Singapore, had created a sense of Japanese invincibility. Midway shattered that perception. The Americans could fight. They could win. They would win. The battle also validated the decision to invest heavily in signals intelligence and code breaking. The work done by Commander Joseph Rockefeller and his team at Station HYPO in Pearl Harbor, breaking the Japanese naval code JN-25 and providing Admiral Nimitz with accurate intelligence about Japanese plans, was directly responsible for the American victory. Without that intelligence, Nimitz would not have known to send his carriers to Midway. They would have been somewhere else, repositioning after the Coral Sea battle, and the Japanese invasion would likely have succeeded. The validation of signals intelligence led to increased investment in code-breaking efforts, which would pay dividends throughout the war. There is a broader historical irony in what happened at Midway, one that extends beyond the specific tactical decisions and mechanical failures. The Japanese operational plan for Midway was designed to force a decisive battle that would knock the United States out of the war for at least a year, buying time for Japan to consolidate its conquests and build an impregnable defensive perimeter. The battle was fought, but the outcome was the exact opposite of what Japan intended. Instead of knocking America out of the war, Midway energized American resolve. Instead of buying time, it accelerated the timeline of Japanese decline. Instead of demonstrating Japanese superiority, it revealed Japanese vulnerabilities. The very battle that was supposed to secure Japan's position ensured its eventual defeat. And at the center of this historical irony are the words spoken by the Japanese admirals in those critical moments when their world was collapsing. Nagumo's repeated question, "How could this happen?" was not rhetorical. It was the genuine bewilderment of a man who had believed absolutely in his fleet's superiority and could not comprehend the evidence in front of his eyes. Yamaguchi's calm orders to counterattack, his controlled demeanor as his division burned, represented a different response, the professional soldier continuing to fight even when he knows the fight is lost. And Yamamoto's weary acknowledgement, sending the order to withdraw, marked the recognition that the war Japan could win had ended, and the war Japan would lose had begun. These were not the words of villains or fanatics. They were the words of professional naval officers, trained in their craft, who had made reasonable decisions based on the information available to them and had been proven catastrophically wrong. Nagumo's caution, so often criticized by his more aggressive subordinates, had kept his fleet safe through 6 months of combat. At Midway, that same caution made him hesitate at critical moments, unable to adapt quickly enough when his assumptions were proven false. Yamaguchi's aggression, so often praised as the proper fighting spirit, led him to throw Hiryu into suicidal counterattacks that achieved nothing except his own death. Yamamoto's strategic brilliance, which had conceived the Pearl Harbor operation and numerous other successful campaigns, had led him to design an operation so complex and so dependent on perfect execution that a single intelligence failure and a few minutes of bad timing unraveled the entire plan. The Battle of Midway was decided not by superior Japanese spirit or American material advantage, though both would play a role in the larger war, but by intelligence, timing, and the decisions made by individual commanders under enormous pressure. The Americans had better intelligence. They used that intelligence to position their forces advantageously. Their commanders, particularly McCluskey and the squadron leaders who found the Japanese carriers, made good decisions at critical moments. And when the opportunity presented itself, when the Japanese carriers were caught in their most vulnerable configuration, the American pilots executed their attacks with skill and determination. The Japanese, by contrast, had poor intelligence, a flawed operational plan, and commanders who could not adapt when their assumptions were proven wrong. Nagumo hesitated. His staff argued about rearming. The reconnaissance failed. The combat air patrol was out of position. Each of these failures, individually, might have been survivable. Together, they were catastrophic. And once the first bombs hit, once the fires started, there was no recovery. The material advantage of the First Air Fleet, its aircraft, its experienced pilots, its carefully maintained ships, disappeared in 5 minutes. What the Japanese admirals said at Midway, in those final moments, reveals the human dimension of strategic failure. They were not spouting propaganda or making dramatic pronouncements for the historical record. They were men watching their carefully constructed world collapse, trying to understand what had happened, trying to maintain some semblance of control over a situation that had spiraled beyond their ability to manage. Nagumo's bewilderment, Yamaguchi's determination, Yamamoto's resignation, these were authentic human responses to the experience of catastrophic defeat. And that, perhaps, is the deepest lesson of Midway. Wars are fought not by abstract forces of history or inevitable tides of industrial production, but by individual human beings making decisions under pressure, with incomplete information, while trying to navigate the gap between what they believe and what is actually true. The Japanese believed they were superior. They had evidence to support that belief. They were wrong. The speed with which that wrongness was revealed, the 5 minutes that transformed certainty into catastrophe, is what makes Midway historically significant. It was not just a tactical victory or a strategic turning point. It was the moment when an entire worldview, shared by thousands of officers and men, supported by 6 months of unbroken success, encoded in doctrine and training and institutional culture, was proven false. The carriers burned. The men died. The admirals watched, and in their words, spoken in shock, in determination, in weary acceptance, we hear the sound of reality asserting itself against belief. That sound would echo through the rest of the war, through the defeats that followed, through the final desperate kamikaze attacks, through the atomic bombs and the surrender ceremony on the deck of the battleship Missouri. But it began at Midway, on the morning of June 4, 1942, when Vice Admiral Chuchi Nagumo stood on the bridge of a burning carrier and asked the question he could not answer: how could this happen? The answer, visible now from the distance of decades, is simpler than it seemed at the time. It happened because Japan started a war it could not win, against an opponent it did not understand, with a strategy that depended on the enemy making mistakes. When the enemy stopped making mistakes, when American intelligence and American adaptability and American industrial power were brought to bear, the illusion of Japanese superiority could not be sustained. Midway did not create that dynamic. It revealed it. 5 minutes of bombs and fire, and the truth became undeniable. The 4 carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, lie today on the bottom of the Pacific, 20,000 feet down, their structures crushed by pressure, their decks collapsed, their hangar bays silent. They are war graves, protected by international law, visited occasionally by deep-sea exploration vehicles that capture ghostly images of wreckage reclaimed by the ocean. The bones of 3,000 sailors rest within those twisted hulls, men who died believing in their cause, following orders, doing their duty. Among them, somewhere in the wreckage of Hiryu, are the remains of Rear Admiral Taman Yamaguchi and Captain Tomio Kaku, who chose to die with their ship rather than survive its loss. Their deaths did not change the outcome of the war, but they stand as testimony to the human cost of strategic failure, to the price paid by individuals when nations make catastrophic decisions. The admirals at Midway, Nagumo, Yamaguchi, Yamamoto, were neither heroes nor villains. They were men trying to serve their country in a war that should never have been fought, using strategies that could not succeed, believing in capabilities that did not exist. Their words, in those final moments when the carriers burned, were not historic pronouncements but human utterances: confusion, determination, sorrow, the simple and profound recognition that something irreversible had happened. The sky above the Pacific on that June afternoon was the same perfect blue it had been that morning. The sun set. The fires burned through the night. The ocean accepted the offerings of steel and flesh. And in the morning, when the surviving ships turned west toward Japan, they carried with them the knowledge that everything had changed, that the war they thought they were fighting was over, and a war they could not win had begun. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now and don't forget to subscribe.